Today we get to hear from another Boulder Rotarian who has done some remarkable things in his life. Fred McLaren joined our club in October of 2007. His sponsor is Pete Steinauer. Fred is a retired U.S. Navy captain, which explains the beat Army cry you heard earlier, who has taken part in some historic voyages. He's also a retired CU professor. Some of you may remember when he spoke to our club about his submarine voyage in uncharted waters under the Arctic ice cap near Siberia as the commanding officer of the USS Queenfish in 1970. Captain McLaren has also made 2 dives to the RMS Titanic, 2 dives to the German battleship Bismarck, and 1 dive to the mid-Atlantic Ridge hypothermal vents. These are just some of the reasons that he is our only club member whose classification is Explorer. Today, Captain McLaren will tell us about his explorations of extreme underwater environments. Please welcome Captain Fred McLaren to our Boulder Rotary Club.
Thank you very much, John. Actually, I became a member of this club in about 1986 or 87. And then I left to be publisher of Science News back in 1991. But whether you realize or not, I was your program chairman for 2 years during that time. Made sure we had programs that could put everybody to sleep right after lunch. It was very restful. And Rotary Club in those days on a Friday after a couple of drinks and then being put to sleep was really the best place to be on a Friday afternoon. Now what I'm going to do, the occasion for this talk is my first book, Unknown Waters, has just come out in a paperback edition. And I've brought along 10 copies to sign or inscribe if anybody's interested. And I think many of you have not heard this talk of the exploration of the Siberian shelf. But when John mentioned my extreme underwater environments, I've been privileged during my life because basically my motto in life has been anything to avoid yard work. So I've found a variety of ways of doing that. And the first adventure, of course, is what I'm going to tell you about briefly this afternoon, the first and only survey of the entire Siberian continental shelf under ice. But then my other underwater environments I talk about that I've explored are the 2 dives to Titanic. And I was on the team in 2001, 2002 to make the first manned dives all the way down to near 16,000 feet. To the German battleship Bismarck, and then the hydrothermal vents, and then added to that, of course, I did some dives during the Vietnam era, the worst of which were around sea snakes off Southeast Asia, which I think takes the cake. It still makes my stomach churn to see 16, 20 sea snakes coming towards you, and you're trying to get down and hug the bottom. But anyway, I'm always looking for something to do. 1960, I was lucky enough to be on the submarine Sea Dragon, and we were the first to make the first northwest passage, look under icebergs, go from the Atlantic Pacific via the North Pole. And just 2 years before, Nautilus had been first to explore the entire Arctic Ocean. Okay, I want to back that up now. God, we're going forward. So anyway, it's hard to believe that even as late as 1958 or 1960, we knew very little about the Arctic Ocean, which is about 6.5 times the size of the Mediterranean. And now, of course, you see a REACH chart showing all the features But back in my day, 58, 1960, I made my first voyage. The only thing we knew about for sure was where the North Pole was, the famous Lomonosov Ridge. But all these features in here still hadn't been determined or even charted. And it's sort of amazing to think that I think the first voyage I made, I don't think there was more than maybe 10,000 soundings in the entire huge Arctic Ocean. Then, of course, in the intervening years, it's been, now I think we've had maybe 160 U.S. nuclear submarines up there. I was on the 4th voyage as a young officer, and then I commanded the 7th voyage. But the big thing was to survey this vast stretch of the entire Siberian continental shelf for the first time in history. And I was lucky enough to get that task in the summer of 1970. Okay. Well, we can thank two people principally for having the modern nuclear submarine and equipping it to operate in the Arctic. First is what we call the COG, or the kindly old gentleman Admiral Rickover, who, of course, was responsible for the nuclear submarine. And I was lucky enough in 1965 to be the second in command of the first of a class of submarine, the Sturgeon class, to go to sea, 37 in the class, all capable of operating in Arctic or Antarctic waters year-round. And this is Dr. Waldo Lyon, little known, but he's the one that came up with all the under-ice acoustic equipment that we could use to safely navigate under ice. Okay, and here are the features on this submarine. Notice now we go to a single propeller. We move the planes for the control surfaces from the bow to the sail. We call it now, this is no longer called a conning tower. And the top of the sail and the top of the rudder were reinforced that we could routinely break through 2 meters of ice without any damage to the submarine. We had an inertial navigation system. And then on the right, you see all those various projections or active acoustic areas, with the principal one being the iceberg detector, which we use to actually pilot under ice in and around, as you'll see, deep projections of ice that are actually at your depth. I'm also a private pilot, instrument rated and all that. And it's like navigating on instruments in the upper part of a subterranean cavern. Now, the submarine is about 4,650 tons, a crew of about 115. And in my day, the nuclear propulsion plant was such that we didn't have to be refueled but about every 7 or 8 years. Nowadays, your modern nuclear submarine does not have to be refueled during its entire lifetime, and maybe up to 35 years. There you see this beautiful submarine underwater, very streamlined, extremely quiet. And in the case of Queenfish, which was the first of this class to go to sea, we could almost turn within our ship length. Here we are heading out from Pearl Harbor in July of 1970 for the Siberian Shelf. You're going to have to watch this, I think. It's just not okay. And we go via Dabob Bay in Washington State. Now, it's the Cold War during 1970. And it still amazes me. I hold a record for Cold War missions, over 20 of them. But back in those days on Cold War missions, and this, even though this was a scientific and oceanographic expedition, it was still considered a Cold War mission, and the rules of engagement were very simple. Generally, you're in waters where sometimes, depending on how your adversary interpreted, Geneva Convention did not apply. And my instructions were always very simple. If I heard an outer door open or a torpedo tube flooded, I was prepared to zap whoever was doing that within about 20 to 30 seconds. So what we're doing here in Daybaugh Bay, Washington, is loading out a full load of torpedoes, the very latest, to protect ourselves up in the Arctic. This is an interesting shot. I had a crew of 115, Vietnam area. Amazingly, over half of my enlisted people had bachelor's degrees, with 5 or 6 of them having master's degrees. All the officers, including myself, had masters in engineering, science, or mathematics. And we had some unusual situations as a result. One of the ticklish personnel problems I had was a Yale officer supervising a Harvard graduate enlisted man who was infinitely better educated than he was. And then look at this man in the front. That's Petty Officer Second Class Sonarman, a parent, born in Hungary. He and his wife had masters from the Juilliard School of Music, and whenever we were in port, they played with the Honolulu Symphony. This man in front was the heir to a major coffee fortune, got tremendous amounts of money every month, very popular with the rest of the crew. This guy in the foreground later became CEO of a major company, and the two in the back there got their doctorates later when they got out. Both were later head of departments at major universities. So I had an interesting group of wild horses. Okay, we take off from Seattle once we're loaded with torpedoes and also stores. And I might mention, I had the bright idea at that time, let's take all 50 state flags in the North Pole and photograph members of the crew with their state flag at the North Pole. Well, the U.S. mail was about the same then as it was now. We got to Seattle with only 32 state flags. I think some of you recall the Seattle World's Fair Center. Somehow, by some miracle, we departed with the other 8, with the missing flags. And it wasn't until we got up here that all of a sudden they wised up and they wanted their flags back, but it was too late. And here's from the New York Times on this voyage, and when this book first came out, did a full page in the science section of the New York Times, and they produced this beautiful illustration. But you see that we navigated the Chukchi Sea and then retraced Nautilus's 1958 route for global climate change purposes, measuring the ice thickness overhead 12 years later to compare with that recorded by Nautilus before, to see if the ice had thinned in response to global warming. When we got back to port, the modern digital computer hadn't been invented yet, so I ended up doing this analysis for my PhD here at the University of Colorado between 83 and 86, and discovered some thinning. Then did the very first survey of the tectonically active Gackle Ridge. I'll say more about that later. And then down to the great unknown, the vast, uncharted Siberian continental shelf. Surveying, getting up here in shallow water under very thick ice and surveying, actually determining a navigable route all the way across about 3,600 nautical miles of the Laptev, East Siberian, and Chukchi seas, and then getting safely out. Well, this is the way the north of the Bering Strait, the edge of the ice pack, looks. I did something at this time which a previous skipper had done with me, and it has a wonderful motivating effect on the crew. You just get them up, come up on deck, contemplate what's ahead of them out for hundreds of miles for as long as they want, and then they figure out on their own that, gee, we're going to go under that. We don't know for how long, and we got to get safely out. It has a wonderful sobering effect. You don't really need to do anything more in the way of motivational talking, okay? And one of the things was unexpected at Chukchi Sea, and of course you always get bad news from the government. And I was told, don't worry about ice in the Chukchi Sea, which is very shallow. You won't encounter any thick ice until you get up in the Arctic Ocean. Oh my God, within 24 hours, we're encountering the ice pack hadn't moved down towards the Bering Strait. And unexpectedly, we find that we have to take the submarine down and hug the bottom, that is within 20 to 30 feet. And this is a 300-foot long submarine, and navigate around ice that's coming right down to our depth, as you see in that illustration. It was a great warm-up. And this is the sole thing we use for navigation. I spent many hours sitting in front of this, and here you see two hunks of ice, and I'm conning us right in between, getting down and hugging the bottom, and being very careful not to collide with the ice. And that's our sole navigation device using that iceberg detector. Now, it was a wonderful sonar, which is called a high-frequency modulated sonar, and it painted out things very well. But you can't have a lapse at all. It just is continually watching it. But it was summertime, and because the water temperature changed from being warm at the surface to cooler, we found to our horror that it caused the sound rays to bend down and away from the ice ahead of us. So we had to navigate about 300 to 400 miles of the Chukchi Sea north of the Bering Strait and into the Arctic Ocean with only an effective range about between 500 and 800 yards ahead of us, or a reaction time, let's say about 3 to 5 minutes, going very slow to detect it and ease around that ice and not collide it. Here we see the polar ice pack itself. It's quite varied. Thicknesses can go anywhere from just open water to the deepest I've ever run that's just been created by the wind up there, about 135 feet thick. So we're not talking about icebergs, ice islands, just what we call dynamically created thick ice. And we finally got through the Chukchi Sea, which was a real sweat, and then we picked up Nautilus's route, and actually coming up and fixing our position at the same time of day, the same day of the year that Nautilus had done 12 years before. And here you see the Nautilus 12 years before us, the captain, Bill Anderson, got, I guess, 8 times congressman from Tennessee later. And Nautilus didn't surface at the pole, but she went right beneath it. Went from the Pacific to the Atlantic in just a few days. Nautilus was the first to measure the ice thickness overhead of her. Ours is a little more sophisticated. But believe it or not, even the time of 1960, and at the time I departed in 1970, there are people, even at the Royal Geographical Society in London, that thought that the ice was perfectly flat underneath. And there were some people that had an idea, like Sir Hubert Wilkins back in the 30s, that all the submarine needed was a big sled runner on the top of it. And you could get under that flat ice and go sled running underneath it. Well, you could see what would happen. You'd get into here between a couple of these ice keels, and that'd be the end of you. Here we are surfaced in the ice in what we call a polynya, or open lake of water. And the way we come up is we'd locate a open lake of water, maybe bigger than the submarine. You'd position yourself directly below it, lower a huge outboard motor called a secondary propulsion motor, and make a vertical ascent up to the center, either to come into the open water or break through the ice. Now, for the survey of the Siberian shelf, then coming up, we developed a technique of just coming up to periscope depth and just putting a foot or two of the periscope up when we were surveying the Siberian shelf whenever we found open water, because needless to say, at that time, the Soviet Union claimed a 200-mile limit, and we were getting in as close as we could, and we did not want to be detected. Here's my first surfacing in the ice, and on the left, you see why we should have considerable concern. All that ice is above the rudder and the propeller. And if any damage had occurred to either, that would be the end of the expedition. Well, you see our smile as a relief there. On my left is an interesting man, Clarence Thomas, God rest his soul. He came to us with 4 Bronze Stars from Vietnam, apparently a real killer, but a great quartermaster and a great scuba man, and found that we had no damage to the submarine. And here we are a little further up, about 83 north, and you're always looking for polar bears. They can be anywhere. And whenever we'd get a chance, we'd let the crew get out on the ice. But there had been 3 of us on board who had been up in the Arctic previously. We had a lot of fun with these guys. You tell them, of course, that, polar bears, what they do is they'll sneak up on you by putting one paw in front of their nose and then just easing up on you and then all of a sudden springing at you. The other thing is, you said we would tell them, you can tell a polar bear you can always tell them when they open their mouths. And, and this made more than a few people nervous because they do just appear out of nowhere. And en route, I had a second command who had come from a ballistic missile submarine, and by this time I had serious worries about him because he had no situational awareness at all. And just to briefly tell you, one of the things you have to have is a good sixth sense and act on your hunches on the submarine. But he was on watch, and there was something just funny about the watch. And he mentioned something about an acoustic anomaly. Well, I came out and looked at what he considered an acoustic anomaly, and my immediate reaction was emergency deep. Anyway, I verified this when I digitized the data on my PhD, but we just got beneath this iceberg and cleared it by 13 feet. And from that time on, the crew would not have this officer on watch or anywhere near the control room. He had the interesting first name of Lincoln. His nickname was Link, but when the crew started calling him Lurch, I knew he had a problem. Okay, we got to cross the Lomonosov Ridge, which is a really spectacular thing. You're running along with a water depth, 16 to 18,000 feet beneath you, and all of a sudden this ridge comes up, and it just comes up sharply, and it stops, maybe 800 or 900 feet below you. And this can occur in a few minutes, and I, like my predecessors, several previous trips, you back down full and turn away, and then you sort of embarrassedly said, "Oh, God, that is the Lomonosov Ridge," and you ease back over it. Oh, I'm going to back up to that. Okay, surfaced at the North Pole, and that's the first time we put on our numbers, and those are just paper there for public affairs purposes. Back that up. And of course, I know there's some non-believers, but there he is. Santa Claus at the North Pole. And on the left, you see really how the weather can change. In all the time up there, a little over 2 months, we only had 3 days where we had sunlight. So it always makes me wonder how on earth Perry and others navigated their way up there on just a sextant. And there you see some of the flags that we finally got away with, all 50 of them. California state flag. And there I am with the Hawaiian state flag at the North Pole. And every one of these flags were presented to state governors on behalf of the submarine force. Why the British flag? Well, you remember the Hawaiian Islands used to be the Sandwich Islands, and supposedly a British possession. Okay. We scuba divers at the North Pole for the second time in history. All right, next. And my navigator and head scuba officer sort of looked like a walrus himself, Toby Warson. And these are pictures taken under the ice. Here you see how you get ice thicknesses up to 135 feet thick. That wind can have ice flows go atop another flow of equal thickness, and one after the other. On the right, that ice now, I don't know where it came from, but it's a little over 20 feet thick. And here you see two sections where the ice is probably about 3 meters, 6 feet thick all told. So underneath the ice, it's highly varied topography and quite treacherous. Okay, here we are. We've taken down the numbers. We're preparing now to go to the Siberian shelf. And on this trip, we were loaded out for 180 days and was basically told not to come back until we'd finished the survey, however long that took. And about 180 days is about the max food you can carry. And right now what we're doing is just checking the top side, we take all the lines out of the lockers, take them below, tack weld everything, then smooth everything down so we have very little flow noise or cavitation. And this is just an hour or so before we're going to submerge, head for the Siberian shelf, and have no idea when we'll go to the surface again. And, back up, please. Here's the way we're going to go. We're going North Pole. Down here, we'll briefly survey the extension of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the Gackle Ridge, which is the slowest seafloor spreading area in the world. It'll be a huge ocean up here one day. Down to the Siberian shelf, the Severnaya Zemlya island group, and then start the survey all the way over this direction, as you'll see in a minute. Okay, what about the Gackle Ridge? Well, we know we did determine it's tectonically active. Nobody has actually been down there to look at it yet. It's one of the things I had hoped to do before I got 2 hip operations. And then just lately, this last Christmas, I slipped on the ice, didn't hit my head, got a completely detached retina, and that just got operated on about a month ago. And that's why I'm staggering around here with a cane and watching my balance. But this is down at about 16,000 to 18,000 feet beneath the sea. And why it's particularly interesting in the Arctic is where you have these hydrothermal vents, you have ecosystems around them. Each are quite different, and they all live on chemosynthesis. Hydrogen sulfide coming out with the water, not on the sunlight. And I did brief Noah about 5 or 6 years ago and got to talk for an hour with 26 Project Europa people. And what I was proposing is a proof of concept mission to make the first dive all the way to actually visually sight this, because the probability is pretty good 30 or 40 years from now. They're going to find the same thing on the moon of Jupiter, Europa, or Ganymede, and that might be the first indication of life up there. I was hoping I could make that first dive, but I'd have to live to about 135 or 140 years, and that's not looking good right now. Okay, here's where we start the survey. The Severnaya Zemlya group. This is the last major landmass discovered on Earth, 1913. And then as deep into the Laptev Sea as we can go. And then we didn't know whether we could go south or north of the New Siberian Islands, but all this is totally uncharted. And to survey all this, get as close to the coast as we possibly could, and then around and come out. And again, I had 180 days to do it. Okay. Well, here's that island group, the Severnaya Zemlya group. Pretty well heavily covered with glaciers. And here's the island group. And you do have some open water near it. But it's giving you a feel already of how severe that environment is up there. That entire Siberian shelf, most of it is very shallow water and very thick ice. And here you see a closer. At this time, I was surveying just 12 miles off the coast, and then my bosses got a little queasy, and The Soviets were trying to get official okay on the 200-mile limit, so we were ordered to back off to 24 miles. But we'd gotten most of this done at 12 miles. And then we went just as deep as we could into here, which was surprisingly far, and then back out. Found a lot of icebergs in this area. And here you're looking at one of the islands in that Severnaya Zemlya group, putting icebergs like this in the water. This is a little 200 feet above the water, and it's aground in 900 feet of water. And one of the things we determined on Sea Dragon in 1960, and we confirmed in 1970, is during the summer months, icebergs, because of the melting, put out a hissing or a seltzer sound that you can hear as a fine pinpoint of energy as far as 70 miles away. And we're in an area where nobody thought there were any icebergs. There was one report thought to be from a drunken Soviet naval aviator in 1938 who reported hundreds of icebergs in this area. Well, we certainly confirmed there was hundreds of icebergs in that area, and if it wasn't for the sound they put out, they'd be a real navigational hazard. Okay, we just finished the survey of the site of the Laptev Sea, and on the latest charts you can see that I really got quite a ways down here, and then we just couldn't find a way to go east. Finally had to go up around the New Siberian Islands. And about that time, my bosses hadn't heard from us for quite a while. They got concerned. We had to pull off out into the Arctic Ocean. Next slide. Next slide. And I've just put the periscope up. We're out in the Arctic Ocean, and I'm just supposed to send a quick message saying we're okay. And as I'm sweeping the periscope around, there's this huge female polar bear. She's a little over 11 feet. She couldn't believe her luck. She reared up thinking at the top of the periscope was a seal, plunged in the water and started swimming madly towards us. Well, I'm not kidding. Her closest point of approach, I had her crosshairs on her nose, and the idle thought entered my head, how on earth am I going to explain teeth marks on my periscope when I get back to port? Okay, next slide. Well, look how close she got. She actually put her nose on the headwind of the periscope, and that's the first time we saw the two cubs. And they decided we were definitely not something to mess with and went running off across the ice. Okay, then we clear the New Siberian Islands, come back and resume the survey, and I still have nightmares about this. This East Siberian Sea is about 1,000 miles across. Average depth, 190 feet. And from the bottom of the keel to the top of the keel, to the top of the sail of the submarine is 54 feet. And so we're actually having, on this stretch, for 1,000 miles, it's almost totally ice covered. There's only about once a day we could find enough open water to come up and get a satellite fix. But very hairy. Let's give you an example. This is taken from some other trip, but that ice underneath is just absolutely horrible looking and treacherous. Next one. There's measuring it overhead. And you're looking at millions of tons, and then this is what we're doing. We're coming through and sometimes getting down within 5 or 6 feet of the bottom and threading our way through these deep pinnacles of ice, in some cases reaching the bottom. And just in a 4-hour watch, you might make 20 to 30, as many as 40 maneuvers to avoid colliding with any of these deep projections of the ice. And here we are. We got pretty comfortable at 20 feet above the bottom, clearing the ice overhead, but 30. But in the Siberian shelf, the bottom was irregular, so it was all moving up and down on you. You were always having to move to avoid. Okay. And something else happened. We started going across these deep gouges And you would have deep areas perpendicular to the Siberian shelf that might be 100 feet deeper in the surrounding bottom. And you think, oh boy, these are great. You could just run straight down those to get closer, but right in the center might be a huge ridge that would project upward. And so there are real navigational hazards. Okay. Second worst day of my life. It was, we'd gotten 2/3 across the Siberian shelf, and we were getting pretty comfortable. Late Sunday afternoon, we're watching the movie Shane. I'm down in the cruise mess, and Jack Palance is just about to get his just dues, and the messenger of the watch comes down and grabs me by the shoulders and just shakes me and says, "Captain, come to the control room immediately." I came up, and what you're looking at is we had inadvertently wandered into what I call an ice garage. We had ice all the way down to the bottom, right in front of us, about 20 or 30 feet, ice down to the bottom on both the port and starboard side, and we were only about 6 feet above the bottom. Ice overhead was about 12 feet, and we hadn't gotten in case, but we were damn close to it, and we were hovering. The first thing I did, of course, is picked up the microphone and said, very calmly, "Don't anybody move." And then what I did is slowly and methodically got on the sound-powered phones with the man on the throttle, and then we had to carefully coordinate backing out the same way we came in without getting stuck in the ice one way or the other. Now, any of you have handled ships or boats, you know with a single propeller, it doesn't just back the way you want. You back with a single propeller. The boat or ship wants to do two things. It wants to squat and it wants to back to port. Well, that wasn't an option. We had to go exactly out as we came in. And so I got on the sound-powered phones and I would tell the throttleman, spin it astern 2 or 3 revolutions. And it seemed like an eternity to get out. But we finally did. We didn't touch the ice. We didn't touch the bottom. We had to shut down one side of our propulsion plant because of the silt below and just hope that didn't shut things down. But we finally got out. And then went around the New Siberian Islands here, heading for the Chukchi Sea, and I thought we were pretty much home free by then in the next one. But we didn't figure on one. When we wanted to go to deeper water and go to the bottom of the Bering Strait, the ice was too thick to go that way. And so we had to locate, for the first time in history, something called the Herald Sea Valley. There was the southern entrance had been discovered, but we had to somehow find the northern entrance to this trench and work our way down under the ice, and we successfully did that. The water depth of the trench was probably about 4 or 5 times as wide as this room, and maybe about 15 to 20 feet deeper, but we did find it and were able to get out and safely get clear of the ice. Here you see we're clear of the Chukchi Sea ice. Next. Through the Bering Strait, heading now for a home part of Pearl Harbor. There you see us returning from the trip. And that's the end of that talk. Now I want to tell you just a little bit about my forthcoming book, which will be coming out a year from now. Next slide. Nope, back it up. It's entitled Emergency Deep, USS Queenfish during the Cold War, 1969 to 73. 4 years. And this book is basically going to be telling you, it'll say a little bit about the Arctic mission, but I hold the record for Cold War missions, and it'll be telling about our going in and collecting intelligence off these Soviet areas. In this case, you see Vladivostok. To the north will be Petropavlovsk, where, next one. There you see Queenfish in the foreground. And we're closing every interesting target almost entirely new Soviet submarines, collecting as much intelligence as we could on them. And there you see the Golf class. It's a diesel-powered ballistic missile submarine. I think there's only 2 or 3 of us to do this. I was the first to do it. I don't want to see this in print. You'll see it in the book. But I actually spent an hour thoroughly filming her from underneath at a range of 10 to 15 feet. First time that ever been done against a Soviet submarine. Needless to say, it made everybody wild. I got flown back to Washington and briefed everybody from the vice president on down, and they couldn't believe the pictures we took. Then next you'll see in the book, next slide, I was able to pick up their latest ballistic missile submarine manned by their top skipper. It was something out of like the Hunt for Red October, and I was able to stay with him right till his patrol, he reached his patrol area, and you'll read about that. Okay? And then finally, we returned to port. Here we're coming back to Yokosuka. I'm up on the bridge bringing her in. And as you can imagine, we were absolutely dead tired. Now, that book's going to be telling a lot about some really hairy and fun adventures to me back during that era. And ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the talk. Thank you. Now, I did bring 10 copies of this to sell, sign, inscribe. If anybody's interested, a quarter of it will go to Rotary, and I'll be happy to inscribe them to you if you're interested. I do want to introduce my wife, Avery. Avery, if you'd stand up a minute. We've been married going on 32 years, but Avery went on 3 North Pole trips with me as I lectured on Russian icebreakers. And in 1999 and 2003, in just a bikini, Avery swam in the 29.5-degree water at the North Pole. And in 2003, she outswam all the Russians.
Well, Captain, thank you very much for an inspiring talk. All puns intended. We have had our understanding deeply improved, and it's clear that you and your crew could handle the pressure. I figure in the Gackle that was at least 562 atmospheres, so very well done. Thank you, and in your honor, Rotary is donating 100 doses to Polio Plus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.